And so, welcome to our webinar this morning, the Bank Information Security Puzzle. What does it all mean and what's right for my bank? We at the ACES Group and Focus Audits decided to do this webinar because we often see a couple of challenges that banks encounter. The first is that the cybersecurity industry is evolving so quickly uh, that um, uh, it's difficult for even the most experienced IT professionals to get their arms around the definitions, scope, strengths, and weaknesses of the different platforms. The second thing we often encounter is compliance professionals or bank executives who don't come out of the world of information technology, yet need to understand enough about information security to keep their bank out of trouble. This creates a problem when examiners, auditors, and IT vendors, for that matter, suggest security measures, and you're left wondering how necessary it is and what the other options are and what's suggested by the FFIEC. My name is Chris Hodge, and I'm the Missouri representative for ACES Group and Focus Audits. ACES has been in business for 25 years, and along with our sister company, Focus Audits, we've worked with over 500 financial institutions, providing information technology, bank operations consulting, information security, risk management, and compliance consulting to community banks. In short, we do all the really nerdy stuff for banks. Our agenda today is designed to provide a simple overview of the different cybersecurity defense platform categories, understand their differentiation, and what the FFIEC has to say about them. With that information, our objective is to help you determine the best cybersecurity measures for your bank. I'm not here to sell you anything today or to demonstrate any particular product or service. My objective is to provide you the tools and knowledge to make sense of the cybersecurity landscape, particularly as it relates to the four categories of cybersecurity platforms, namely next generation antivirus, endpoint detection and response, security incident and event management, and managed detection and response. Now, before I dive in, I must offer a quick disclaimer, okay? I'm going to be speaking in generalities. There's really a wide variation in capabilities of different platforms. And when I talk about different technology platforms, the understanding is that they're all fully deployed. Moreover, I cannot speak for the different regulatory agencies. I'll be using the FFIEC Cybersecurity Assessment Tool as a guideline, and some of the declarative statements may be open to interpretation by examiners or by your auditor. If you have any questions during the course of this webinar, feel free to use the chat box on the left-hand side to send them to me. We'll have a few minutes at the end of the session for questions and answers. Now, there's obviously much more to cybersecurity than just these four categories of platforms. And there's some platforms that may not fit neatly into boxes. After all, the developers are always trying to get an edge, and they aren't developing for the purpose of staying within our boxes. But these categories provide a reasonably good overview of defenses that are deployed on the network side of the firewall. The first category is next generation antivirus. And with that, we'll include traditional antivirus and anti-malware. Antivirus looks for a signature on a file that matches a known threat. However, next generation antivirus looks for tools, techniques, and procedures that attackers may be using. It looks for patterns and event streams that suggest something malicious, and even uses machine learning to spot anomalies at an endpoint. Endpoint detection and response, or EDR for short, it's the response to the fact that antivirus and its descendants are never going to be able to prevent every cyber attack. EDR assumes that threats are going to bypass prevention defenses, so it focuses on monitoring endpoints to detect behaviors that include malicious activity, and it captures data for forensic and security investigations in order to respond. EDR solutions generally incorporate the prevention capabilities of next-gen antivirus, but it adds the ability to correlate and cross-correlate events across the network. but that is limited to the endpoints only. Both next generation antivirus and endpoint detection and response are endpoint solutions, meaning that they analyze and protect at the workstation, PC, server, or device level. Next generation antivirus is often referred to as an endpoint protection platform, and it's a first line defense mechanism effective at blocking known threats. EDR is the next layer of security, providing additional tools to hunt for threats and forensically analyze intrusions at the endpoint. Security incident and event monitoring, also known as SIEM or SIM, I've heard it pronounced both ways. I pronounce it SIM normally, and I have colleagues who pronounce it SIEM. Well, the important thing is that it aggregates and normalizes event streams and behavior across the entire network. SIM correlates and cross correlates events on the network and at endpoints. It incorporates data from a wide range of sources to provide context and raise the alarm to anomalies that warrant further investigation. Both endpoint detection and response, as well as security and event monitoring, require a great deal of configuration, monitoring, management, and incident response. Managed detection and response is the outsourcing of those functions. I just realized I probably should not have used the image of a nut this close to lunch. I'm probably making a few people somewhat hungry at this point. Hopefully not. Let's begin with the foundation of good cybersecurity defense, and that's at your endpoint. There's antivirus and anti-malware, and then there's what is often called an endpoint protection platform, which is a fancy way of saying next generation antivirus. The difference is largely marketing. Traditional antivirus and anti-malware looks for a signature in a file that matches a known threat. That approach leaves a host of threats that traditional antivirus doesn't address, such as brand new viruses known as zero-day threats, fileless attacks, threats moving laterally across the network, and insider threats. After all, attackers are constantly evolving in their tools and techniques, so the savvy ones are not going to attack you with files that have a known signature. So a new generation of antivirus has evolved that's appropriately named next generation antivirus. Now, next generation antivirus addresses many of the weaknesses of traditional antivirus. While it still examines files for signatures of known threats like traditional antivirus does, there are a couple of advances that make it much better. First, it looks for the tools, techniques, and procedures that attackers use to spot nefarious events. Rather than just looking for signatures, it looks for patterns in event streams that suggest something malicious. And they often use machine learning or artificial intelligence to alert you to anomalies at an endpoint. Next-gen antivirus adds the benefits of a behavioral approach to identifying threats. The upshot is that next-gen antivirus significantly expands the scope of the threats you're defending against by examining behaviors at the endpoint that are similar to known threats and the tools and techniques they use. Some examples of next-gen antivirus include Carbon Black endpoint protection, CrowdStrike Falcon, ESET endpoint security, Kaspersky endpoint security, Sentinel-1 endpoint protection, and Symantec endpoint protection. Now, odds are that everybody on this call has antivirus in their environment at a minimum. I certainly hope you all do. And probably next generation antivirus. So the real question for banks running next generation antivirus is it enough? And much of the answer to that question comes down to the strengths and weaknesses. Next gen antivirus is very good at quickly identifying uh, quickly identifying and containing known threats and their variants. The databases of information from which the AI and machine learning draw are huge and generally comprehensive. I'm sure you've all seen with your own antivirus and the number of threats it stops. But it does have some limitations. True zero-day threats that are different enough from known threats may get through. It doesn't recognize lateral movements, such as an intruder who's moving around your network and probing for weaknesses. Analysis is limited to event patterns on individual endpoints and not all across the different endpoints. It's designed to recognize and stop known threats and their variants, so next-gen antivirus doesn't provide the forensic capability to determine what's happened if somebody does get past it. And once you've had a breach, the ability to determine where and how it happened is critical to preventing its return. For example, you need to be able to answer, who was it? Was it an insider? Did they leave a back door? Or is our network just possessed? Next gen antivirus won't help you answer any of those questions. Now, when it comes to the benchmarks established by the FFIEC Cybersecurity Assessment Tool, antivirus and anti-malware alone is sufficient for baseline maturity on a number of components. Deploying antivirus is sufficient to meet a number of the baseline components in the cybersecurity controls domain of the CAT, and a few more in the cyber incident management and resilience domain. I believe it is worth mentioning, though, that antivirus, and certainly next-gen antivirus, provides the capability to meet the minimum threshold for the components listed here. But as we discussed, it can be limited. For example, the statement tools and processes are in place to detect, alert, and trigger the incident response program. Next-gen antivirus can do that, but as we know, there are whole categories of events, such as lateral movements, that it doesn't have visibility into. So that brings us to endpoint detection and response. Endpoint detection and response addresses many of the weaknesses of next-gen antivirus. As I mentioned briefly before, EDR is a response to the fact that next generation antivirus is never going to be able to prevent every cyber attack. I'm sorry, it's reality. EDR assumes that threats are going to bypass prevention defenses. So it focuses on monitoring endpoints to detect behaviors that indicate malicious activity. And it captures data for forensic security investigations in order to respond. Most EDR platforms have some level of automated response. In fact, they normally incorporate next-gen antivirus capabilities to prevent intrusions at the endpoint. And EDR enables the centralized monitoring of endpoints so that you can detect lateral movements. That centralized monitoring also expands your view of anomalous behaviors and allows correlations and cross correlations across your endpoints. Now, there's a new concept. If you're not familiar with correlations, it's similar to the analysis of event streams that next-gen antivirus performs on a single endpoint, but it analyzes and compares event streams across all endpoints on the network, looking for patterns that would suggest some sort of nefarious behavior or, again, some sort of anomaly. Some examples of endpoint detection and response platforms include McAfee Endpoint Security, Sophos Intercept 10, Carbon Black's CB Response, Cisco AMP for endpoints, and Trend Micro Apex One is an excellent platform as well. The advantages of EDR begin with the fact that it provides an additional layer of defense by providing greater visibility to suspicious behavior. So it's easier to detect threats that may have made it through your first line of defense. If you are breached, EDR makes it much easier to determine how it happened, who the intruder is, what the intruder did, So you might uh, know who you need to notify, and you can also find out whether or not they left the back door. But like anything else, though, EDR is not all rainbows and unicorns. The greatest weakness is that it's blind to all non-endpoint data, such as a firewall. It's labor intensive. You need to know your endpoints and configure the platform correctly. You may get a lot of false positives, and you do need to keep the platform updated and configured. And when it comes to event analysis and incident response, you can't just thaw out a frozen caveman and put him at a terminal. To fully utilize the platform, staff needs significant training on the platform, as well as in the threat analysis. Now, in case you're wondering, I grew up watching SNL and I've watched it on and off for decades. I think you can actually date somebody by the SNL characters they recognize. I recognize all of them, which just about all of them. So that probably tells you how old I am. And gosh knows it may tell you even more than that. Anyway, moving on. When it comes to your cybersecurity maturity level, endpoint detection and response helps take you beyond baseline. And as you can see from the first component, the FFIEC is looking for capabilities to detect and block actual and attempted attacks and intrusions. All of the items you see listed here exceed the capabilities of most next generation antivirus. But most EDR platforms do, in fact, allow you to meet each of these requirements. Now, I don't want to suggest that endpoint detection and response is the only way to satisfy these components. It's not. However, it is an efficient way to satisfy these components. And as you can see, it satisfies a lot. For example, look at the fourth item. Here for evolving maturity. It's tracked cyber incidents are correlated for trend analysis and reporting. There's that correlation that EDR provides. When you get to intermediate maturity level, you have requirements for data loss prevention, real-time incident detection, and monitoring for anomalous behavior, all of which are capabilities of a good EDR platform. This brings us to security incident and event monitoring, also known as SIEM or SIM. You can think of SIM as being like endpoint detection and response in the basic concept of how it works, namely via data aggregation and correlation. But SIM ingests a lot more data and provides much greater context. Security incident and event monitoring allows monitoring of the full network and endpoints in real time. It creates a baseline for activities so that you can recognize anomalies across the network when they occur. We talked about correlation earlier when we discussed EDR. The SIM technologies normally excel at correlating events from a number of disparate data sources and not just from endpoints. Think of all the devices on your network. They're all creating logs of events. But for illustration purposes, let's say they're in different languages, okay? Well, in many cases, they actually are. But let's say your firewall speaks Dutch, your routers speak French, your servers speak Spanish, and your endpoints speak English. Now, you may have the tools to monitor and translate each one individually, but it would be slow, and you're likely to lose much of the context in translation. Moreover, you're reading each log in isolation, so you're likely to miss patterns. The SIM translates them all into one language and analyzes all of the events across those devices for patterns that correlate to known malicious patterns, or patterns that are a complete anomaly and suggest further investigation. And it provides context. There's a wide range of the kinds of data and devices that different SIM platforms can ingest and normalize. For example, Some cannot read logs from an AS400. On the other hand, there are other SIM platforms that can monitor an AS400 and even monitor the dark web for your passwords and even correlate data from your core processor in some cases. And there's even a newer generation of SIM platforms that use AI and machine learning to baseline normal network and user behavior. Examples of popular security incident and event management platforms include Splunk, Logarithm, Alien Vault, and AdLumin. Now, I'm sure you've noticed some overlap between the platform categories we've discussed. After all, as I mentioned before, each of the software providers are trying to make their platform more competitive, so they're not interested in staying in our boxes. But a good way to visualize it is to look at a network such as the one pictured here. Antivirus and next-gen antivirus detects and isolates known threats and their variants on your PCs and workstations. Endpoint detection and response adds another layer of defense, allowing detection and analysis of suspicious activity and anomalies at the endpoints from a single terminal that allows you to see the bigger picture. And security incident and event monitoring ingests, aggregates, and correlates data from endpoints and firewalls and routers. Now, how much difference does it make to be able to see what's going on with the network devices in addition to the endpoints? Well, the answer is it makes a huge difference. 50% of intrusions are detected at the firewall, and another 30% of intrusions are detected at the server or another network device. The network devices are the most likely place to catch an intruder. But then that raises a second question, okay? What's the point of SIM when those network devices themselves normally have their own monitoring capability? After all, you're already probably paying somebody to monitor your firewall already if you're not doing it yourself. And if you have next-gen antivirus or EDR, you're also monitoring your servers and workstations, right? Well, remember that SIEM is a second layer of defense to catch bad actors that make it past your first line of defense. For example, let's say one of your team falls for a phishing scam and unwittingly gives a hacker their password. So the hacker uses that password to sign on to your network. The firewall might register a low-level alert if that user then logs in from an unusual location or outside of normal hours, but nothing serious enough to block it. It really depends on your firewall settings. But the SIM will register that and see that same actor as he or she logs into a server that the user wouldn't normally go to, but the duped user still has enough access to that server to avoid a high level alarm. So the intruder will probably not be detected yet. And then the intruder goes to a PC and performs a task that's unusual, but doesn't set off an alarm either. After all, the intruder has your password. Oh, this is a scary scenario when you look at it, but all is not lost. This is where SIM comes in. The SIM brings the data from that firewall and that server and that endpoint together into a single decision engine and one pane of glass for the analyst to analyze and recognize an overall pattern that's either similar to what an intruder would do or a pattern that's never been seen on the network before. An anomaly that an intrusion analyst can start tracking and investigating. Security incident and event monitoring is an intrusion analyst's favorite tool. It really is. It provides real-time visibility to the entire network. It's the most effective way to spot insider behavior or lateral movements that may indicate a breach. And when it comes to spotting insider behavior, it may not even be something as obvious as an employee trying to access a file to which they don't or shouldn't have permission, but an employee suddenly downloading much more information from a database that they do have access to. That can signal an employee trying to steal information. A real life example comes to mind. There was a company that I worked with once whose vice president of sales had given notice. And the company decided to let him work out his 2 weeks because he'd been with them for so long. So they trusted him, even though he was going to a competitor. Well, then an analyst on the scene saw he was downloading huge amounts of data from the sales database. It was a database he used every day and certainly had full access to as the VP of sales. But being able to detect the sudden increase in volume being downloaded alerted the company to the fact that he was stealing the customer database. They were able to catch him before he could get the data out of the building and escort him off the premises. The drawback is that SIEM can be very labor intensive. It normally requires a great deal of time and energy for configuration, and it requires constant upkeep and maintenance to be effective. SIM platforms do tend to generate a lot of false positives, so it requires a lot of tuning. And you do need to be sure that the SIM is able to access the data and logs it needs. As I mentioned before, if you have an AS400, you need to make sure that it's able to access AS400 data. Otherwise, your analysis is worthless. The biggest problem with SIEM, though, is not technical. It's operational. Staff need to be well trained on incident response as well as on the platform itself. Most SIM platforms are very complex and have layers and layers of rules and exceptions, and your staff needs to know how to create and maintain them. Moreover, the staff needs to be available to see the alerts and respond at a moment's notice. Monitoring a SIM in real time really can be incredibly tedious, as Olya Pavlotsky is happy to tell you. SIM satisfies a number of components in the intermediate and advanced maturity levels of the Cybersecurity Assessment Tool. In particular, it satisfies those components that refer to multifaceted attacks, where you may need to correlate more than just the endpoints. You'll notice that it also satisfies those components that refer to detecting insider threats, as SIM is especially adept at recognizing employee behavior that falls outside the norm. You'll also see the final item here expects you to be able to detect and block zero-day attempts. SIM is the best tool for detecting zero-day attempts since it can detect anomalies across such a wide range of sources. This all leads to a common question. Which is better, incident and event management or endpoint detection and response? They both ingest large volumes of data and do correlations. But SIM outperforms EDR when it comes to detection. It ingests and correlates many more data sources and types of data sources, and provides much more visibility to events and more context when they occur. But SIM is not always the better option. SIM is a tool for intrusion and event detection, not prevention. Most SIM platforms rely on endpoint solutions to block events at the endpoint. And even though SIM provides excellent detection of events on the network, it relies on intrusion prevention systems to block access. The upshot is that endpoint detection and response is quicker and allows faster response to most events at the endpoint. It also generally includes capabilities of next-gen antivirus. In fact, many next-gen antivirus vendors treat EDR as the next generation of next-generation antivirus. The good news is that they're not mutually exclusive. The optimal solution is both, since SIM can ingest the endpoint intelligence of EDR. Now, you may have noticed a recurring theme when I was talking about the cons or weaknesses of both EDR and SIM. They're both resource intensive in terms of the manpower required to run them correctly in particular. Uh, I'm not just talking about the number of man hours required, but the skills and training required to manage it. The Gartner Group summed up the challenge for EDR as being less technical than operational. That is, the organization has to have the staff with the correct training to be available almost around the clock. And the Gartner Group is even more blunt about this issue when it discusses SIM. Look at what it says here. Your investment in SIM will be completely, totally, absolutely wasted if you don't have smart people operating the tool on an ongoing basis. Wow. Well, come on, Book Gartner, tell us what you really think. Don't beat around the bush. Well, does that mean that EDR and SIM are off limits to organizations without substantial information security teams? Now, before you expect the wah wah of Debbie Downer, there is a solution to that challenge as well. This is where managed detection and response comes in. Managed detection and response is a service that provides the manpower to set up and maintain a SIM or EDR along with providing the platform itself. It provides the trained personnel to set up and configure the platform, help find the baseline for activity, and tune the platform to alert you to true anomalies rather than false positives and noise that's inherent in a network. Then they actively monitor your network with trained security people. It's the ongoing monitoring and maintenance that's really the hardest part of managing a SIM or EDR. And due to economies of scale, most managed detection and response services can do it more economically and effectively than one or two individuals who may have multiple responsibilities. And most managed detection and response services include more than just monitoring the SIM or EDR platform. Things such as asset discovery, vulnerability scanning, and threat analysis. And they may even include some level of remediation assistance. Now, this is the point where I normally lay out the pros and cons of the platform I'm discussing. And when it comes to the pros and cons of managed detection and response, it's probably more instructive to discuss the pros and cons of the alternative of trying to do it yourself. In large part, because the most obvious advantage of setting up and managing the platform yourself is that you don't have to pay any service fees to vendors. After all, a service provider isn't going to set up and manage your SIM or EDR for free. And most MDR providers have a specific SIM or EDR platform they'll implement for you because that's the one on which they're trained and experienced. But there are some comparatively inexpensive SIM or EDR platforms on the market that you can use in case you do decide to do it yourself. So there is a money saving there. You know your business and your environment, and it helps to have people monitoring who at least understand the applications and impact on their organization. Another advantage of doing it yourself is that you can achieve greater utilization of your existing IT staff. I'm not being tongue in cheek. Really, there are scenarios where you may have acquired another bank, for example, and you're wondering how to integrate the new bank's employees. Finally, if you're just aiming to check certain boxes on the CAT tool or satisfy another request of an examiner, you can achieve compliance by implementing your own SIM or EDR. One caveat, though, is you might have to put air quotes around the word compliant because you may not have the resources to achieve the true intention of that compliance component. Now, the downside of doing it yourself may extend beyond the likely problem that your IT staff has enough to do already. Alerts often require immediate investigation, and threat analysis and remediation, well, it's a different discipline with different training and even its own certifications. So it becomes one more qualification for which you need to be staffed. And beyond the certification and training, incident response experience is very important when something bad actually happens. Think about what happens when there's a serious incident. Unless you've had that same incident before, your analyst will normally need to research it to find out what it means. In a best case scenario, they're able to Google it and find it fairly quickly and get some information on it. That's still going to take about 10 minutes. If it's a breach or ransomware, every minute is critical, and 10 minutes can be a long time. Then you have to determine the best course of action for remediation. Whereas in a security operations center that's staffed for monitoring multiple organizations, there's a much greater likelihood that the analyst will have seen the incident sometime before and will be able to respond much more quickly. In fact, it's not at all unusual that organizations with a SIM don't have sufficient manpower to monitor it adequately, and log reviews end up falling behind. Alerts are not responded to quickly. Now, don't get me wrong. These platforms are normally designed to email or text somebody if a serious alarm is triggered. But often the first line responder becomes so overwhelmed with quote unquote noise from the network or false alarms. Those alerts are set to a dangerously low level of sensitivity. And that way, it only alerts your first line responder to something that's really obvious, and you may overlook something that you really should be paying more attention to. When it comes to the FFIEC, MDR satisfies additional components of the cybersecurity assessment tool that simply operating a platform would not. For example, the second item here, security processes and technology are centralized and coordinated in a security operations center or equivalent. Any MDR solution should provide the infrastructure to meet that requirement. But where MDR really satisfies the CAT tool is for the components that require trained manpower, such as monitoring systems operate continuously with adequate support for efficient incident handling, or security logs are reviewed regularly. And how about this one? A threat intelligence team is in place that evaluates threat intelligence from multiple sources for credibility, relevance, and exposure. Yeah, obviously that's a team, and that's where a managed detection and response service comes in handy. But keep in mind that MDR is not the only way to satisfy these components, and also notice that these components are for cybersecurity maturity levels beyond baseline. Well, those are all the different platform categories, but all of this discussion begs the question, what makes the most sense for my bank? Well, it's sometimes helpful to know what other banks are doing. So I'd like to take a poll of you folks on the webinar today. You're all a fairly representative sample of community banks in Missouri. So what do you all do? If you open the polling box on the left-hand side of the window, that is your Zoho meeting window, you'll see a poll there for what platforms your bank uses. It's completely anonymized, so we can't see what each bank does, but it might be helpful to see what percentages do what. We'll give it just another minute and for people to respond and look over the different options. Looking at our responses so far, it's very interesting. Give it just a moment more. Looks like people are still voting. All right, time's up. It's interesting. Of the different things we have listed here, we have 7 banks, or 21% of respondents, said that they're using traditional antivirus, anti-malware only. 15%, we had 5 votes for next generation antivirus. 8 votes, 24%, are using endpoint detection and response. Another 8 votes, the same number, are using security incident and event monitoring. And 5 banks, 15%, are using managed detection and response. It's pretty well balanced. It really is. I think that's really interesting. Thank you all for participating in that poll. Now I'm going to try and make sure I can close this poll without closing the entire meeting. All right. That brings us back to our meeting. Now, throughout our discussion, we've been looking to the FFIEC because it does create pretty good benchmarks. In terms of what you have to do to stay out of trouble, it may come down to what is your inherent risk profile. What's your inherent risk level, and therefore what cybersecurity maturity level you need to achieve. If you only need to achieve baseline cybersecurity maturity, your next generation antivirus should be sufficient for that relative to the other platforms. Again, going back to my disclaimer at the beginning, I'm speaking in generalities as there's a wide variation in capabilities. I'm also not suggesting that next-gen antivirus is the only thing you need to do to achieve baseline maturity. You should be able to achieve baseline maturity, though, when it is next-gen antivirus is fully deployed. Where the challenge occurs is if you want to go beyond baseline maturity. You cannot achieve certainly not evolving maturity without the ability to correlate events for trend analysis. And that's very difficult to do, if not impossible, without good endpoint detection and response at a minimum. It used to be endpoint detection and response with correlation capabilities is a somewhat recent thing. Up until fairly recently, when endpoint detection and response had the ability to do correlations, people had to go to SIEM in order to achieve evolving status, because you had to use SIEM in order to get the correlation capabilities. Well, now EDR gives you that capability, at least at the endpoints, so that you can achieve your evolving maturity level with that. Achieving intermediate maturity would be difficult, if not impossible, without SIEM, because of the requirements of detecting multifaceted attacks. The question of managed detection and response versus a DIY approach is really more of an operational and staffing resources question. Now, the FFIEC really shouldn't be the only consideration. I do want to mention that. The FFIEC Cybersecurity Assessment Tool, it is becoming dated given the evolution of threats and cybersecurity since the last major revision in 2016. And most banks are looking to continually improve their information security. And just because you're not actively trying to achieve another cybersecurity maturity level doesn't mean you shouldn't begin making plans to move to the next step. It's still a good idea to have EDR, even if you're staying at baseline. And SIEM is the gold standard that you shouldn't wait until you need to be at intermediate maturity to adopt. The bottom line is that you should consider your information security strategy and objectives. Now, I have to confess that whenever I hear the word strategy, I can't help thinking of Will Ferrell's impression of George W. Bush explaining how he planned to win the war in Iraq with strategery. But in all seriousness, it's okay to have an information strategy and objectives that don't wait until the FFIEC says you must achieve a certain goal. And there is one more consideration I want to leave you with. A good information security program encompasses policies and operations, as well as the technical infrastructure. So it's not uncommon for organizations to enhance their information security infrastructure, but forget to communicate their information security policies or update their business continuity plan for it. And it's not unusual for organizations to underestimate the operational resource requirements of a security infrastructure upgrade. And it's not uncommon to have the policies and procedures that fall short because the technical infrastructure doesn't really accommodate what's intended. It's important for all three of the traditional pillars of information security to remain in sync in your organization. Well, I do also want to say that don't ever let analysis paralysis keep you from moving forward, though. If you ever do need help keeping your policies, operations, and infrastructure in sync, or if you need to keep need help taking the next step, ACES Group and Focus Audits are here to help. Please forgive the shameless self promotion, but I had to get one in before the very end of our time here today. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have to leave, feel free to email me any questions and I'll follow up with you. If you do have questions and don't mind staying on the line, again, just enter your question in the chat box and I'll answer them the best I can. One more thing, some of you may be aware that we have a bank information security officer peer group that meets every 6 months in Colombia. These are great events where bank ISOs from around the state share best practices and collectively tackle an issue that's timely to bank information security. Our next meeting is April 21st. So put that on your calendars. I'll send more details to each of you as the event approaches. So do we have any questions? The questions, if you do want to send a question, they are on the left-hand side. There's a Q&A box on the left-hand side of your Zoho meeting app. You can type a question in there. Will the slideshow be available to us? The answer is yes. I'm happy to send a copy out to each of you. And we're also recording this, so I'll be happy to send you the link to the recording as well. You're welcome, Betty. Any other questions? Well, that gives you all 10 minutes back in your day. So again, thank you all for joining, and I hope this has been beneficial for all of you. Take care.